We are going to be very fortunate to hear comments from two experts on poverty inequality study. So Esther Duflo from MIT and then Branko Milanovic from the City University of New York and then Gabriel Zuckman. So they will each talk, and after that we will sit here and we will take questions from the audience, both about the report in general, what we've heard in the first session, and about what the discussants are saying. So we are going to start with Esther Duflo. So I will make a very short introduction. I'm sure all of you know about her. She's a world-famous development economist at MIT, one of the most highly decorated young economist. So she's done a lot of work in developing countries, and her specialty is really to look at things from the field at a very micro level. That is, she's been doing a lot of randomized experiments all over the world to see which type of policies or interventions can help tackle poverty in developing countries. So it's going to be very interesting to hear her perspective that contrasts with our approach that is really about aggregating data from across all countries to obtain statistics on poverty. She's going to tell us about how we can shift that curve of poverty at the world level, perhaps starting from the ground with all the experiments she's been studying over the years. So Esther, please come and speak here at the podium.
Thank you very much. I will speak very briefly. I will try to make 3 points. So first of all, congratulations to the whole team. And this is a beautiful day, beautiful report. That was point 0. My 3 points are: first, thank you very much. I'll explain that. Second, a couple of requests. And third, what I take, if I had one substantive conclusion from this entire set of work, bring it perhaps to the broader context of my own work, as I was told to do as a discussant always. So first, thank you. And this is a phenomenal amount of work to produce all of these results. This is also phenomenally useful, both to do the work and then to present it in this way that is readable, clear, accessible, transparent. It has the objective of shifting the public debate on these topics, and I think it has succeeded already. It will do even more. This is a phenomenal amount of work that I'm sure most people in this room know, but maybe it is worth emphasizing for people in the media, for the reference to try and bring not only sort of the key insight, but also the amount of decisions that have to be made and data set that have to be found. And if you read just the executive summary, there is some sentence about the methodology that allows to solve this problem. The methodology is really such a small, it's important, but such a small part of the whole thing compared to digging into all of the data set and looking for every single data. So that's the first part of it. This is, in a sense, this similar to the effort that we never, similar in spirit to the effort that we never acknowledge in our own work when suddenly we start using GDP. They are trying to expand the notion of GDP to include a national account, to include distribution, but that's very much the same approach of we need to take the choices that needs to be taken to arrive at some summary measure. This is not always pretty, so that's the other way that I want to say thank you personally. I could not do it. I feel uncomfortable whenever I need to make an assumption that I cannot personally discuss with. And of course, you cannot do this exercise without dealing with data that is less than perfect and making assumptions that are somewhat heroic here and there. And that someone is willing to do this and is willing to apply as much common sense as possible in doing this. This is a great boon to the rest of us, the people who would not even get close to this. So that's another reason why I'm saying thank you. And that brings me to my second point, requests. I have 2 requests. One is that, of course, that starts with an acknowledgement that it's wonderful that the data is available, that people can play with it, that people can, change some of the assumptions. I think it would be great if there was a sense of the uncertainty or the uncertainty surrounding some of these numbers, because what we have in the final report is a set of numbers. They are the numbers. Well, of course, it is clear and it is made clear that it is based on a series of choices, on a series of extrapolation, for example, that needs to be made. There is absolutely no lack of transparency on that, and again, people can go play with it. But I think that it would be nice if there was some sense for people to, even someone who is too lazy to get into the database, to have a sense of where we know very well what is being said. So if in the US we are talking about the fraction of the income that goes to the top 1%, at the moment it is very well known. But then if we're talking about Africa, where there might not be even one survey, then we know a bit less. And so some way, I don't know even what it would be, but some way of conveying how much certainty there is would be wonderful. The second request, and this is where it comes, closer to my own work, is to add. This is really something to add to the wonderful body of summary statistics already there, is to add something on poverty. Because right now we have a lot on the 50%, the poorest people in the world. In my books, in my line of trade, someone who is at the 50th percentile of the world distribution is pretty rich. In India, someone who is at the 50th percentile of the world distribution and lives in India would be, of course, near the top of the distribution in India. So, and it turns out that delivering data on poverty is in some respect easier than delivering data on inequality, because a lot of the issues that we have on survey data in developing countries, where when I'm talking about poverty, I'm really talking about extreme poverty, people who live under $1 a day, $2 a day, $5 a day, etc. That is something which they are much easier to survey, it turns out, than the richer people. So I think actually some is known and exists, of course, to some extent in some data set. It would be a nice combination. As it turns out, from my understanding of what has happened to poverty since 1990, is very similar to what they're saying, what the report tells us what happens to the bottom 50%. So I don't think substantively there is anything misleading in the data there are now. But in practice, it could be quite different. So in practice, we're seeing in the report that the bottom 50% is doing pretty well in relative terms. And similarly, we also know that the number of people living under $2 a day has been about halved since 1990. So concretely, the conclusion is the same, but it wouldn't have to be, because it could be, for example, that in India, all of the growth happens for people who are, even if it were in the 50th percentile of the India distribution and above, then maybe nothing would have happened to poverty. So I think it would complete, to have some focus on poverty would complete nicely. That's another thing to add. Of course, it's another set of data set to look at. But that would be a wonderful complement. Now I want to finish by saying what are the substantive conclusions I take from, stepping back and saying what are the substantive conclusions that I take from the report. And that's another thank you, because in a sense it's sort of justify what a lot of my project has been since I've been an economist. I work, as Emmanuel has said, on evaluation of social policy, the design and the evaluation of social policy, in particular towards the very, very poor, mostly in poor countries. And something that I have to contend with in a lot of my work has been the almost instinctive reaction that's very nice what you're doing, but this is the small things. The only thing that really matters to do something about poverty is economic growth. Look at India, look at China. They got rid of poverty. This is where the poverty went away, because they grew. So you're always saying, well, yes, in a sense, if we were sure that growth was the only thing that mattered, and if we knew how to influence growth, then yes, it would make sense to work only on growth for poverty, but both of these things are not, potentially debatable. On the second point, if we knew what to do about growth, I think the macroeconomic profession has nicely come to the conclusion that they don't. So that's nice. And then this gives me ammunition on the first one, which is, this seems pretty self-sustaining, but there is absolutely nothing automatic between the economic growth of an economy and what happens in the country. And of course, this should stand to reason, but I think this shows it. This data show it very clearly. In poor countries, so here we have in particular China and India, economic growth is good. Clearly, you need some economic growth to improve the situation of the poor, but it's insufficient, because nothing says that the growth the share of the growth that goes to the poor is going to be sufficient to make them less poor. Now, it turns out that you really don't need all that much, because since the poor are very poor, you need just a little bit of growth of the economy will take a lot of people out of poverty, because you don't need a lot of dollars to make someone go from $2 a day to $2.10 a day. So partly this is, even if we see that in China and India, as growth has come up, inequality has increased, even with that, there is still a little bit left over. But it was not necessarily the case. It could have been that the growth would have been entirely captured by the rich. And we know that this is what happened in the US, for example. So it could have been the same in China and India. There is nothing automatic about growth leading to improvement at the poor. It's related to distribution, how it is distributed. And of course, then we think, well, but then you can discuss growth and tax policy, and then you're done. But what the report, even in the short version, clearly acknowledges is that when we're thinking about distribution, and in particular distribution towards the poor, it is not just about taking the money from the rich. We'll have to figure out what is the right way to distribute it such that the poor can hop on the bandwagon at some level. So I've always contended that if we are very interested in poverty, which is what I work on, the only thing we can know for sure is to try and improve the situation of people here and now. And then with a bit of luck, that's going to put them in a position to hop on the growth bandwagon if and when such bandwagon comes. And the report talks about education, for example, as something being essential and maybe lacking in the US, which is one reason why people have not hopped on that bandwagon. In developing countries, we want to think about education, we want to think about health, we want to think about all of the various things that it seems to make sense will be necessary for the poor to be able to capture some of the growth. Now, the question of distribution is of course essential, because if the rich take all the money that there is, which seems quite plausible, it could happen, then there would be nothing to distribute. But then if they don't take all the money that is created by growth, then the question of how we effectively redistribute to the poor, and in particular, is there ways to redistribute that put them in a position to take advantage of the growth even when it comes, seems like essential questions to resolve. So in the rich countries, growth is nice to have, and it's certainly not sufficient. We could go into detail in the question of China and India and how they have had specific policies of redistribution, more or less, and of social policies, more or less effective in both countries, but who probably played a role in keeping the poor enjoying the benefit of the growth, even as inequality was exploding in both countries. But the last point is that, and this is another jab at economic growth, the other thing that I guess was in the back of my mind but became very clear in reading this paper is, so right now, for example, there is this whole debate about whether the tax reform in the US will increase economic growth or not. And so most economists think it will not. And then some loonies think it will. But it's beside the point. even if it does, the first order effect is that it's going to increase inequality. The fact that it has a second order effect on growth, we don't care one way or the other. It is irrelevant. In fact, it is possible, one can argue that from a social point of view, and then from a political point of view, when you live in the US like I do, is something which is very, very salient right now, the growth that has happened in the last many decades has been bad. Not even that, we would be better with no growth, because on the one hand, none of this growth came to the vast majority of the people, and on the other hand, it creates both the sense for the vast majority of the people who don't benefit from the growth that exists, that they are a bunch of losers, because since the economy is growing, how it is that they are not doing great, and creates this, very big inequalities, which has been one of the reasons of creating social resentment. So as people see there is all this growth, see the benefit none of it, either they think they are loser, or they think that someone else must be stealing it from them, which could be the Chinese, the Hispanics, the blacks, pick your pick. And so it kind of reinforces me on the question that working on the question of growth per se is not a very fruitful exercise. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Esther, for these comments. So next, we're going to hear from Branko Milanovic. So Branko Milanovic is currently at the City University of New York, and he is a veteran of inequality studies, and indeed he is a pioneer of studying the world income distribution. That is, he was, among the first to put together survey data from a number of countries to build what is effectively a world income distribution. In a recent study, actually, with Chris Lackner, he built the first elephant curve of how growth is at each percentile. And as you can see, from the report we presented this morning, his pioneering work has very much inspired us to build on his contribution, try to improve the data, especially with our expertise capturing the top of the income distribution. So we very much look forward to hear the reaction of Branko to our report. Branko.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Emmanuel, for the very nice veteranish introduction. Of course, it's a pleasure to be here. I actually want to say I'm extremely pleased. In my tweets, actually, I mentioned this is a little bit like the World Cup of inequality studies. So I guess in 2 years we will have another maybe regional competitions even to come to Paris. And indeed, it is, I think, important because of the enormous work, which actually we have heard also from the presentations, this morning, and also Esther has mentioned. So it's enormous work, but I would like to emphasize, I think it has two objectives, in my opinion. It's reaching two objectives. One is incredible work on inequality and knowing global inequality much better. But the other part is actually breaking into the mainstream economics, where unfortunately inequality still is not mainstream. Even after 10 years after the crisis, it is still not fully integrated. And secondly, also branching out towards the popular interest, which is very huge, but of course is also in need of better or more exact data. So in that sense, I think it is, of course, a great contribution. It puts together fiscal data particularly, which are good at the very top. I will not repeat all the things that we know, but it also uses obviously household survey data, national accounts, and of course there is another sort of a breakthrough, which is the use of distributional national accounts to put together really basically the national accounts, which were essentially GDP driven, but also to look at how the distribution of that national accounts count takes place. Another part which is important, I think, of course, Gabrielle will talk about that, is the inclusion of evasion, because it's a very important part. We study, inequality using surveys, we study using it administrative data, obviously fiscal data, but there is one part which is never covered anywhere. It is by definition not covered in the surveys. It is by definition not covered in fiscal account in fiscal data, because people would not report. I mean, by definition, they have to sort of move that money when it was not be taxed. And it's probably increasing in importance. And I think it's an important point, because I think globalization has made movement of capital of that nature much easier, and the top 1% uses that. The report also highlights the importance of China up to now, which is not a novelty. Of course, we have known that, be it in poverty or global inequality, that China has played really the key role. But it also emphasizes, I'll mention that towards the end also, is that role has really is coming to an end. In other words, China was a great equalizer, but as China becomes richer and richer, that great equalizer role is no longer played by China. It becomes then played by India, and maybe in the future by Africa, which is, of course, the question mark, because we don't know if Africa will converge in the way that Asia has converged in these last 50 years. And then highlights the importance of India and the huge inequality in India. I really would like to highlight that point, because it is something that the report does, which is actually not very well acknowledged or known, because Indian data used to be, household survey data were very venerable, 1952, from 1952, and they show a much lower level of inequality than income data, and much lower level of inequality than fiscal data. So it's something really very important. And then finally highlights the importance of reducing what they can call the marginal gains of the national top 1%, whereby I mean, as in the projections, as actually Luca spoke before, the assumption is that the rich continue taking the same share of total income. And that's really basically sort of a new approach of looking in projections, by assuming that the marginal gain of the rich remains the same. So I think we are now, of course, in a very special period of time. I would like to emphasize that, because we have, this is implicit and sometimes explicit in the report. We have decreasing or constant global inequality, and in most cases, rising national inequality. So that's the first one. Then we have emergence of the global middle class, and we have declining middle classes in practically all rich countries, not only the US and the UK. We have it in Finland, we have it in Sweden, we have it in Germany. We have, somewhat paradoxically, from the point of view of 20 years ago, we have much greater acceptance of globalization in the South than currently in the North. You see that from Pew Research Fund questions. We have the rise of Asia, which is quite well known, and actually continued decline of Africa, which is somewhat less known, because Africa sort of tends not to take too much space, but with the population increase in Africa, this particular fact will become more and more important. And then we now have, which is an interesting phenomenon, I call the disarticulation in the West, which in the past we used to believe that happens only in the poor countries, with an elite which is integrated into the global world, and a hinterland, or some people who are actually not very happy with that, and who actually don't find their place there. And there is, of course, a lost decade in the West. Actually, the term was used in the report. But because the distribution is unequal and heterogeneous, that lost decade was not obviously lost decade for everybody. For some people, it was actually quite a good decade, and for many others, it was not. Now, I did simple summary of what actually Luca already presented today, so I will not go over that, but you can read the numbers. But it is really striking how the world has changed in 2 generations. So if you look at these countries, France, I took France intentionally because it doesn't show much of a change, but everywhere else, you see the share of the top 1% increasing really by leaps and bounds. It's like, in double digits numbers. So it is really, if we look at the world today and the world that it was in the late 70s or early 80s, these are really 2 different worlds. The interesting part, however, that this world of the late 70s, early 80s was also the world where the between country inequality was probably around its peak. So structurally, today's world is very different. Then what I did also, I looked at the data that Christoph Lackner and I did with household surveys and with top income adjustments. So we adjusted top incomes because of the reason that you all know that, that household surveys really do not cover the very top 1% or maybe top 3% very well. And this is the blue line, and this is actually the Gini coefficient obtained from household surveys with top adjustment. Then I took the red line, which is actually coming from the report, which is the top 1%. As you can see, actually, they don't, on the vertical axis, you have on the left, you have the Gini, and on the right, you have the top 1%. So you see, actually, the movements are not very dissimilar. You know, both reach a peak. Actually, household survey data reached the peak already in the peak of inequality, already in the early 2003, 2004. Here the peak is in 2008, just at the time of the crisis, and the sharpness of the increase of the top 1% is greater, because obviously the Gini is a very sluggish measure. Gini is not going to actually show you that much of a sharpness. When it comes to the decline, as you can see, it's actually fairly similar between 2007, 2008 until today. So this is the same story also in a summary. The decline from the peak in our case with the household surveys is 8 percentage points. With the decline of the top 1% is 7 percentage points. And then with the exchange rates, it's actually also interesting. I like that the report introduces the exchange rates, not only PPPs. Obviously, these shares go up. In the terms of shares, it goes by 2 percentage points up. In terms of Gini, we are talking about 10 to 12% Gini point increase. So it's actually quite dramatic when you think that actually the Gini of the world using and even probably underestimating it for top incomes, and plus underestimating it because of an inability to include evaded money, or a sort of tax haven money, is something around almost 80. So that's an incredibly high Gini that actually no country has, even South Africa doesn't have. And one thing that we have somewhat of a change, although this is a rough calculation, is the mean income. Mean income in the world that we get from household surveys are $15 to $17 per day. Here, actually, I took a number that the report presents. It's per adult, so I'm not sure that I really got the right number between the number of adults and number of people in the world. I looked at Wikipedia. It does have a little bit of it, and but I came with something which is $25 per day. So there is I think, if these numbers, if my calculations are true, then there is a slightly higher, significantly higher mean income in the database that we were presented today. Finally, when I speak of Africa, one thing that I actually want to point out is what is an interesting phenomenon. As the world is getting richer, as the mean goes up, the median also goes up, particularly when you have large countries like China and India that move up through the income distribution. But the irony of that is that if you are not going at that speed, and you're behind these countries that are large and they're improving, then actually your sort of distance from the median becomes larger. And that's why you might have yet another somewhat contradictory development, that the percentage of people who are in poverty, where poverty is defined in relative terms as like 1/2 of the global median, is going up. And these are the people who are kind of left out, not necessarily because they're becoming poorer, because they are not. Actually, they're becoming richer, but not at the speed with which the median and the mean of the world are going up. And, of course, especially not at the speed that the top 1% goes up. And my last slide is the sort of lessons that I took from the report. The first one is the China effect. As I said before, is about to be over. So we cannot any longer rely on China to drive global poverty down, to stop global poverty from increasing. So the China effect is kind of waning. I used to say to my students that actually now the world has two big sumo wrestlers wrestling global inequality down. One is China, the other one is India. And actually that one sumo wrestler, because it became rich, he abandoned sumo wrestling, and now we really cannot count on that. It's really now India which really is about to take or should take the role of China. The second one, which I also mentioned, is African divergence becomes a force for growing inequality, which is a problem unless Africa becomes the Asia of the 21st century. And that is a problem for global poverty, it's a global problem for global inequality, and obviously it is a problem for migration. So, as I said before, Africa, because of its rising population, will come to play much more important role in the further World Cups that we have here with, maybe in 10 years or so. And my final point is that, of course, the lesson or the threat to global inequality, that if the rich countries continue by taking the same share of continue by taking the same share of the additional income as they did during the past 2 decades, then we are in this scenario of business as usual, which actually is extremely divergent force and a force for the rising global inequality. And as I said, I think before, is actually very much like this approach of sort of studying, obviously projecting the future, nobody knows what will happen, but that's a nice approach of looking at the marginals and saying, okay, the business as usual is basically, we just say that the rich take the same share in the next 20 years that they have taken in the past 20 years. So this would be, in my opinion, the biggest threats to global inequality, and I think actually that these are the issues that should make us all sort of think how to avoid them in the future. So thank you very much again, and congratulations to the authors.